At the break of dawn, the air was thick with an eerie silence that hung over the vast plains. A lone Crow scout, his eyes sharp with the instincts of a seasoned warrior, ventured out to search for his horses. His senses were heightened, as the tension in the air whispered of danger. As he climbed a hill that overlooked the valley, his breath caught in his throat. Below him, stretching out like a dark river, was an ominous force, a sea of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, their numbers overwhelming, their horses snorting in anticipation. The sound of drums could almost be heard beating in time with the rising sun. The warrior's heart raced. He had stumbled upon something that could spell doom for his people. He wasted no time. Heart pounding, he raced back to the Crow camp, pushing his body to the limits, desperate to reach his people before it was too late. Every stride was a battle against time itself. Upon arriving, he shouted his warning, his voice urgent and filled with fear. The camp exploded into motion. There was no time to debate, no time for doubt. 10 of the Crow's most skilled warriors, veterans of countless skirmishes, immediately mounted their horses, their faces grim but determined. These men knew their task was perilous, perhaps even suicidal, but it was necessary. They were to hold off the charging force just long enough for the rest of the camp to fortify their defenses. The warriors galloped toward the hill, where the enemy was gathering strength, preparing to unleash their fury. They rode with the knowledge that their people's survival depended on them. Behind them, the rest of the Crow tribe worked frantically to erect the makeshift fortress of teepee poles and covers, each piece a fragile barrier between life and death. Women and children huddled together, the weight of fear heavy in the air. The Battle of Pryor Creek was about to begin, and no one knew how it would end. For years, the Sioux and the Crow had been locked in a bitter rivalry. The Sioux were fierce, relentless in their raids on Crow territory, always counting crews. Acts of bravery performed against their enemies, to climb the ranks of warrior society. To the young men of both tribes, warfare was more than survival. It was a path to honor, a proving ground where courage was tested, and names were forged into legend. But this conflict, like so many others, was more than just a battle between tribes. It was a collision of cultures, a struggle for dominance, for pride, for the right to claim the land beneath their feet. By the mid-1800s, the westward expansion of the United States began to take its toll on the indigenous peoples of the plains. The Sioux, once free to roam the vast stretches of today's North and South Dakota, were pushed westward by the relentless tide of settlers. With their ancestral lands under threat, they looked toward the territory of the Crow with hungry eyes, seeking a place to rebuild their lives. But the Crow, who had long called this land home, would not give it up without a fight. Tensions mounted, and soon, skirmishes between the two tribes became more frequent, each encounter bloodier than the last. As the years passed, these raids turned into full-scale battles, each side determined to break the other's will. The Battle of Pryor Creek was one such confrontation, a moment of reckoning between two powerful forces on a collision course with destiny. In the heat of battle, bravery was not just a virtue, it was a necessity. Young warriors from both sides, eager to prove their worth, charged into the fray with reckless abandon. For the Sioux, victory meant reclaiming a sense of pride, avenging the many wrongs done to their people as they were driven from their lands. For the Crow, it was about survival, holding on to the land that had sustained their people for generations. But what made this battle even more compelling was the duality of perspectives that survived long after the last arrow had been fired. In 1910, an elderly Sioux man, a survivor of the Battle of Pryor Creek, made his way to the Crow Reservation with his wife. His face was lined with the scars of time and battle, but his eyes still burned with the memories of that fateful day. He told his story often, recounting every detail of the fight, his voice filled with both pride and sorrow. On the other side of history stood a Crow warrior named Child in the Mouth, who had also fought at Pryor Creek. He, too, carried the weight of those memories, and like his Sioux counterpart, he never tired of retelling the tale. Between them, they preserved the legacy of the battle, each story a thread in the complex tapestry of their people's history. In the early summer of 1859, tensions between the Sioux and Crow reached a boiling point. A Crow war party ambushed and killed a promising young Dakota Sioux warrior. The warrior had already counted numerous crews in previous battles, each one earning him great respect among his people. He had been adorned with an eagle feather war bonnet, a symbol of his achievements and his bravery. His death sent shockwaves through his tribe. His mother, a proud and strong woman, was devastated by the loss. Grief consumed her, and she vowed not to rest until her son's death was avenged. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she led her son's horse through their camp, the war bonnet tied to the saddle, a somber reminder of the life that had been taken too soon. Her grief was a visible, haunting presence, a dark cloud that hung over the Sioux camp. And as the days passed, her sorrow hardened into a resolve that mirrored the tension building between the two tribes. This was no longer just a battle for land. It was a fight for honor, for justice, for the blood that had been spilled. As the battle raged on at Pryor Creek, the sounds of war filled the air, the clash of steel, the thud of arrows striking flesh, the war cries of men who had dedicated their lives to the fight. Blood stained the earth, mingling with the dust beneath the horses' hooves. The warriors fought with a desperation that came from knowing that their survival, and the survival of their people, hung in the balance. On the hilltop, the Sioux and their allies charged down toward the Crow with ferocious speed. The earth trembled beneath the weight of their attack, their war cries echoing across the plains. The 10 Crow warriors who had been sent out as a vanguard knew that their lives were the only thing standing between their people and annihilation. They fought with a fierceness that astonished even their enemies, holding the line just long enough for the rest of the Crow camp to form a more formidable defense. But the Sioux were relentless, their numbers vast, and soon, the two sides were locked in a brutal, bloody struggle. Neither side gave an inch. Every warrior fought as though the fate of their people depended on their individual strength and skill. Bows twanged, arrows flew, and the screams of men echoed across the battlefield. It was a scene of chaos, a maelstrom of violence, where the line between life and death was razor thin. In the aftermath of the battle, the stories that emerged were not just about the bloodshed, but about the courage and sacrifice of the men who fought. The Sioux survivor, whose name has been lost to history, continued to share his tale until his dying day. And Child in the Mouth, the Crow warrior, did the same, ensuring that the legacy of Pryor Creek would never be forgotten. Though time has passed, the echoes of that battle still resonate in the stories of the Sioux and Crow. The land, once soaked in blood, has long since healed, but the memories remain, passed down through generations. The Battle of Pryor Creek, like so many other conflicts of the plains, was a defining moment in the history of these tribes. It was a reminder that while the land may be vast and the sky endless, the bonds of honor, courage, and sacrifice are what truly endure. As the morning mist rose from the plains and the smoke from smoldering fires drifted lazily through the camp, a solemn figure moved among the teepees. It was the morning woman, her presence as constant as the sun's journey across the sky. Each day, for a whole year, she challenged the warriors of her people. With a voice that carried both sorrow and anger, she cried out, "Is there no man among the mighty Dakotas who will take this horse and fight the Crow? Is there no warrior who will avenge my son?" Her words, sharp and filled with anguish, echoed across the camp. The warriors would bow their heads, avoiding her eyes, burdened by the weight of her grief. Yet day after day, no one stepped forward. The war horse, once ridden by her fallen son, remained untouched, its saddle empty, a silent testament to a mother's unresolved pain. But one day, the cycle of silence was broken. Brave Wolf, a young warrior of great promise, had been deeply troubled in recent days. He had fallen in love with a girl from the village, a beauty whose presence stirred something deep within him. Her laughter, her smile, her very being had captivated his heart. He had made the decision, he wanted her as his wife. Confident in his choice, he approached his sisters and aunts, asking them to arrange the marriage. However, to his shock, they refused. His heart sank as his outspoken aunt, known for her brutal honesty, finally said what the others were too polite to voice. "We do not like her," she said plainly. "She is not fit to be your wife. We do not want her as a sister-in-law or daughter-in-law." The rejection cut Brave Wolf deeper than any blade could. His dreams of happiness with the woman he loved were shattered in an instant, and the sting of his family's disapproval was unbearable. In that moment of despair, Brave Wolf felt as though life had lost its meaning. He considered the ultimate escape, death. But not just any death. He would die with honor, fighting for his people. If he could not have love, he would find solace in battle. He made up his mind to join a warrior society known for taking a suicidal oath. Warriors who pledged to die in the heat of battle, fighting until their last breath. It was not long after that Brave Wolf's fate crossed paths with the morning woman. As she made her way through the camp yet again, challenging the warriors to take up her son's cause, Brave Wolf found himself standing in her path. This time, when she issued her challenge, there was no hesitation. With steady hands, Brave Wolf stepped forward and took the reins of the warhorse. The morning woman's eyes filled with tears, though not of sorrow this time, but of pride and relief. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "At last, a brave one has taken my son's horse. My son's spirit will now rest, for his death will be avenged." The news of Brave Wolf's bold action spread like wildfire through the camp. Warriors and villagers alike gathered around, whispering his name in reverence. Brave Wolf, the warrior who had been so broken by love, was now an instant hero among his people. As the crowd swelled around him, the village elders decided that this moment required more than just admiration, it required action. A council was called, and the most respected chief stood before the people, his face etched with the gravity of the situation. His voice boomed over the assembly, "This is not just the decision of one man. By his action today, Brave Wolf has set in motion something much greater. We, the Dakota, are now committed to an undertaking that could shape our future." The Great Spirit has spoken through this brave warrior, and now we must answer." The chief's words resonated deeply within the people, stirring their hearts and minds. The Dakota, once hesitant, now found themselves unified under a common cause. The chief continued, "The Raven people, our traditional enemies, have outwitted us in battle for too long. They are cunning and their warriors are skilled, but their numbers are few. The time has come for us to rise against them and reclaim our honor. But let us not be hasty. Let us take 1 full year to prepare for this fight. We will plan, we will strategize, and when the time is right, we will strike." The assembly of warriors and elders dispersed, but the decision had been made. The gears of war were now in motion. Over the following months, the Dakota people dedicated themselves to preparing for the inevitable conflict. Every night, as the fires burned low and the stars glittered in the vast sky, the warriors trained relentlessly, honing their skills and sharpening their weapons. The women of the village crafted new arrows, repaired shields, and ensured the warriors would be well provisioned for the battle ahead. As the leaves began to turn and the air grew crisp with the coming of winter, another council was called. This time, it was not just the Dakota who would gather. Emissaries were sent to the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, inviting them to join in a grand alliance against the Crow. The emissaries carried with them tales of the mourning woman, of brave Wolf's bold act, and of the chief's vision for the future. They spoke with passion and conviction, urging the other bands to unite for this noble cause. Their words did not fall on deaf ears. The Cheyenne, proud and fierce in their own right, listened carefully. They, too, had suffered at the hands of the Crow and saw this as an opportunity to settle old scores. The Arapaho, though initially hesitant, were eventually swayed by the promise of victory and the prestige that would come with it. By the time winter settled in, the Dakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had formed a powerful coalition, ready to move as one against their common foe. Throughout the long winter, the emissaries remained with their allied bands, continuing to build support for the great campaign that would come in the spring. They shared stories of past battles, of heroic deeds and glorious victories, and slowly the momentum grew. The warriors of all 3 tribes began to see this not as a simple raid, but as a monumental moment in their history. It was not just about land or revenge, it was about the survival of their way of life. The Crow, meanwhile, remained unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. They continued their raids, confident in their abilities to outmaneuver their enemies. But as the snows began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, the Crow would soon learn that they had vastly underestimated the determination and unity of the Dakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. As spring dawned, the plains came alive with the movement of warriors. Camps were broken down, and vast war parties assembled, each one larger and more formidable than the last. Brave Wolf, now a symbol of strength and resilience, rode at the head of the Dakota forces, his heart no longer weighed down by sorrow but filled with a fierce determination. He had chosen his path, and now he would see it through to the end. The alliance moved swiftly and silently, their numbers swelling with each passing day. By the time they reached the borders of Crow territory, their ranks were vast, their resolve unshakable. The battle that was about to unfold would be unlike any other that the plains had seen. It would be a fight for dominance, for survival, for honor. As the warriors of the Dakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho prepared to charge into battle, brave Wolf looked out across the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to rise. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, but it did not scare him. Instead, it filled him with a sense of purpose. He had chosen to die with glory, and now, that moment was at hand. He tightened his grip on the reins of the warhorse, the very same horse that had once belonged to the mourning woman's son. Today, brave Wolf would fight not just for himself, but for his people, for his ancestors, and for the future of the Dakota. And so, with a cry that echoed across the plains, the Great Alliance surged forward, their war cries mingling with the sound of pounding hooves. The Battle of Pryor Creek was about to begin, and it would be a day long remembered in the annals of history. A day when brave Wolf and the warriors of the Dakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho wrote their names into legend. By the time May arrived, the gathering place at Big Goose Creek and Little Goose Creek had transformed into a spectacle of power and unity. Warriors from all corners of Dakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho lands converged in what would become one of the largest encampments in Sioux history. The sight of it was awe-inspiring, a sea of teepees stretching out in every direction, banners flying in the wind, and the scent of smoke from countless fires rising into the sky. It was said that never before had all the bands of the Sioux come together in such numbers, united under a single cause, to wage war against their ancient enemy, the Crow. As the days passed and more warriors arrived, the encampment grew larger, filling with the hum of preparation. Weapons were sharpened, horses tended, and scouts dispatched to keep a close eye on the movements of the Crow. The air buzzed with excitement, tension, and the grim anticipation of battle. For the warriors who had gathered, this was a chance not only to prove their courage but to carve their names into the history of their people. Scouts soon returned with vital information. The Crow were camped at Pass Creek, only a half-day's ride to the north. The news spread like wildfire through the camp, and within hours, the war chiefs had assembled in council to decide their next move. This was to be a defining moment, a moment that would set the course of events for generations to come. Among the war chiefs was a respected figure known as Night Horse, the Arapaho chief. Tall and imposing, his presence commanded the respect of all who gathered there. When it came time for him to speak, the camp fell silent. His voice was calm but filled with the weight of what was to come. The Dakota people and their Cheyenne friends know me as Night Horse, he began, his gaze sweeping across the council. Other tribes know me as well. I fear no man from any enemy tribe. There was a pause, a moment of tension as everyone awaited his next words. Then, unexpectedly, he continued with a confession that stunned the council. "I am Crow by birth," he said, "and I will not fight my own relatives." A murmur of surprise rippled through the gathered chiefs and warriors. Some looked at each other in confusion, others in silent disapproval. But Night Horse stood firm, unflinching. "This is not the way of our people," he said. "To destroy another tribe is wrong. This is not a native war you are planning. I will have no part in it." The silence was deafening. Night Horse's words were a stark departure from the prevailing sentiment of the camp. But despite his refusal to join the fight, he was not entirely abandoning the cause. He turned to his warriors and addressed them with a tone of solemn authority. "However," he said, "I give my permission to my warriors to stay and fight with you if they desire. They are free to make their own choices. You have heard me." Without another word, Night Horse stood, his decision final. He broke camp that very night and set out for the Bighorn Mountains, a solitary figure of honor and conviction. But before he departed, Night Horse made a crucial decision, one that would change the course of the impending conflict. He dispatched his 2 sons, both of whom were half-crow, to warn the crow camp of the looming danger. Their mission was clear: alert their kin to the massive war expedition now gathering against them, an army of thousands of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho ready to descend upon their camp. Night Horse's sons rode swiftly, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. The crow had little time to react, and when the 2 messengers finally reached their camp by Rotten Grass Creek, it was already evening. The crow leaders listened intently as the half-crow brothers explained the situation. The news was grim: a vast enemy army was only a day's ride away, and their only hope of survival was to flee before it was too late. Without hesitation, the Crow chiefs made their decision. They could not afford to stand and fight such overwhelming numbers, not without reinforcements from their other bands. The camp was packed up in haste, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the Crow were already on the move, heading west as fast as their horses could carry them. They knew they needed to link up with the other Crow bands if they had any hope of withstanding the onslaught that was surely coming. As the Crow retreated deeper into their territory, they traveled with the knowledge that the enemy was relentless and would not stop until they found them. But they were resourceful, and their knowledge of the land gave them an advantage. By the time the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho arrived at Rotten Grass Creek, they found nothing but an empty camp, the embers of fires long since extinguished, and the tracks of the Crow disappearing into the west. Frustration began to grow among the warriors of the Alliance. They had come together in such great numbers, prepared for a glorious battle, only to find that their enemies had slipped through their fingers. But the war chiefs were not ready to give up. This was not over yet. They pressed on, determined to hunt down the Crow and bring them to battle. The plains echoed with the thunder of hooves as the Allied forces pursued their quarry, pushing deeper and deeper into Crow territory. The Crow, for their part, were moving quickly and with purpose. They knew that their survival depended on their ability to stay ahead of the enemy while also gathering strength from their scattered bands. By the time they reached the relative safety of the western valleys, the Crow had managed to regroup with other bands, and their numbers had swelled. What had begun as a seemingly one-sided conflict was now turning into a complex game of cat and mouse, with each side maneuvering for position, seeking an advantage that could turn the tide of war in their favor. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had the numbers and the desire for victory. But the Crow had cunning and the advantage of knowing the terrain like the backs of their hands. For days the 2 forces shadowed each other across the plains, each one waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Scouts darted back and forth, bringing reports of enemy movements, while war chiefs on both sides plotted their next moves with the intensity of a chess master. It was a deadly dance, one that could erupt into violence at any moment. The warriors of the Great Alliance grew restless. They had come for battle, not for an endless pursuit. The blood of their ancestors called out to them, urging them to fight, to claim victory and honor in the eyes of their people. But the Crow were elusive, always just out of reach, and it seemed that the longer the chase went on, the more determined they became to survive. As the days wore on, both sides began to feel the strain. The plains were unforgiving, and the constant movement took its toll on the warriors and their horses. Supplies began to run low, tempers flared, and the tension that had once united the Allied forces began to fray at the edges. But the war chiefs knew that the moment of reckoning was coming. Soon, there would be no more room to run, and the two forces would meet in a final, decisive battle. The Crow, now reinforced by their own warriors, knew they could not avoid the confrontation forever. They prepared themselves for the inevitable, their hearts steeled for the fight that was to come. They had been pushed to the brink, but they would not go down without a fight. The battle that lay ahead would be one for the ages, a clash of titans on the open plains, where only the strongest and most cunning would emerge victorious. As the sun began to set on the final day of pursuit, the two forces finally drew close to each other, the distance between them shrinking with every passing hour. The warriors of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho could feel it in their bones. Tomorrow would be the day. Tomorrow they would face the Crow in battle, and the outcome would be decided once and for all. The stage was set, the warriors were ready, and the plains, silent and vast, waited to bear witness to the coming storm. As the Crows scrambled to hastily take down their teepees and pack their horses, the urgency in the air was palpable. There was no time for ceremony, no time for lingering goodbyes. The war drums of their enemies echoed faintly in the distance, a haunting reminder of the fate that awaited them if they didn't move swiftly. The Crow warriors, along with their families, began their hurried march toward the Bighorn River, their hearts pounding as fast as the hooves of their horses. They knew the land well, but this was no ordinary flight. It was a race against time, a desperate attempt to stay one step ahead of an overwhelming enemy force. As the Crow made their way toward the Bighorn, their enemies were already on the move. Thousands of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, all mounted and armed for battle, began their march with a deafening roar. Their war cries cut through the crisp morning air, carried by the wind across the plains. The wives and girlfriends of the warriors sang farewell songs, their voices a mixture of pride and sorrow, while the old men who had fought in countless battles before sang songs of praise, recounting the glories of the past and urging the younger warriors to fight with honor and courage. The massive column of warriors stretched for miles, accompanied by noncombatants who had joined the march. Old warriors, some too weak to fight, but strong enough to bear witness to what they believed would be the final defeat of their longtime enemy, traveled alongside their younger counterparts. For them, this was not just a battle, it was the culmination of a centuries-long struggle for dominance. It was their chance to finally wipe out the Crow, to erase them from the annals of history. Scouts, darting ahead of the main force, brought back reports of the Crow's position. The Crow had made it to the Bighorn River, a short distance below the canyon, and their camp was set up with about 400 lodges. The war chiefs of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho gathered in council to discuss their strategy. It was decided that the attack would come at dawn, under the cover of darkness, when the Crow would least expect it. They would strike swiftly and mercilessly, overwhelming the Crow camp before the sun had a chance to rise. But when the dawn broke, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, the Crow were gone. Their camp, once bustling with life, was now eerily empty, the embers of their fires still faintly glowing in the early morning light. The war chiefs stood in stunned silence, their victory slipping through their fingers like sand. The Crow, as elusive and cunning as ever, had managed to escape once again. The chief in command of the massive Allied force stood at the edge of the abandoned camp, surveying the scene. He estimated the size of the Crow's fighting force, calculating 3 warriors for each lodge. By his count, the Crow had around 1,200 warriors, a paltry number compared to the 8,000 to 10,000 Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors now pursuing them. The odds were heavily stacked against the Crow, but the chief knew that their enemy was resourceful and could not be underestimated. With a sense of grim determination, the chief turned to his warriors and addressed them. His voice was filled with the certainty of victory. "Today, when the sun sets, there will be no more Crow left," he declared. "We will kill all their warriors and even the old men. We will save their young boys and raise them to become Dakota warriors, and we shall marry their wives and daughters to raise more warriors to fight the whites when they follow us to our new land." His words were met with a chorus of cheers, the warriors' spirits renewed by the promise of total victory. This was not just a battle to them, it was an opportunity to reshape their future, to claim the land as their own, and to build a new generation of fighters who would protect their people against the encroaching forces of the white settlers. As the day wore on and the Allied forces continued their relentless pursuit, the Crow were on the move once again. By the time evening fell, they had reached Pryor Creek, their horses weary from the journey, but their spirits unbroken. They knew they were being hunted, and the tension was thick as they set up camp for the night. There was no peace to be found, only the unsettling quiet before the storm. The Crow warriors, though vastly outnumbered, prepared themselves for the inevitable clash that loomed on the horizon. At dawn, as the first rays of sunlight touched the earth, a Crow warrior named Hits himself over the head went searching for his horses. His mind was focused on the mundane task at hand, unaware of the impending disaster that lay just beyond the next hill. But as he crested the hill, his heart nearly stopped. Below him, spread out across the plains like a living sea, was a mass of men and horses. The warriors of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were gathered, their weapons gleaming in the early light, their war cries already building in the distance. They were preparing to charge, their eyes fixed on the Crow camp below. Hits himself over the head felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. There was no time to think, no time to formulate a plan. He had to warn the camp, had to give them a chance to defend themselves. He turned and raced back down the hill, his feet pounding against the earth as he ran with all his might. Every second counted, and as he reached the camp, his voice rang out, desperate and urgent. "The enemy is here," he shouted. "They're coming for us." The Crow camp exploded into motion. Warriors grabbed their weapons, mothers gathered their children, and the entire camp braced for the onslaught that was now moments away. The warriors of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho began to mount their horses, their war cries growing louder as they prepared to descend upon the Crow with the full force of their numbers. The stage was set for what would be one of the most intense battles of the plains. The Crow, vastly outnumbered but fiercely determined, prepared to make their stand. For them, this was not just a fight for survival, it was a fight for their very existence. The Allied forces, driven by a thirst for revenge and a desire to secure their future, surged forward with a deadly purpose. The Battle of Pryor Creek was about to begin. The fate of the Crow and the future of the plains hung in the balance. The man raced as fast as his legs could carry him toward the Crow camp, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he knew he had no time to waste. The enemy was close, and every second counted. When he reached the camp, his shouts rang out through the air, a dire warning that sent shockwaves through the Crow people. Panic rippled through the camp, but the warriors quickly steeled themselves for what was to come. 10 of the best Crow warriors, men who had faced death many times before, were immediately selected and sent forward to confront the charging horde of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Their mission was simple yet deadly: to hold off the initial charge long enough for the rest of the Crow to form battle lines and build makeshift fortifications from teepee poles and covers. With grim determination, the 10 Crow warriors mounted their horses and rode directly toward the approaching enemy. The ground trembled beneath them as they charged into the ranks of their foes, firing arrows and bullets with deadly precision. Sioux warriors fell beneath their onslaught, their cries of pain mixing with the sounds of war. But the Crow knew they could not linger. They turned their horses and began racing back toward their lines, but behind them, thousands of warriors surged down the hills in pursuit. The earth itself seemed to shake beneath the thunderous hooves of horses as war cries pierced the air. The Crow camp was ready. In the open flat area where the Crow had chosen to make their stand, the first line of defense had been established. Warriors armed with rifles, muskets, and bows knelt or crouched in position, their weapons trained on the advancing enemy. Their hearts pounded in their chests, but their hands remained steady, waiting for the moment when the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho would cross the creek and charge. As the enemy drew nearer, one of the Crow chiefs stood tall and raised his voice in a loud command. The moment his voice carried across the battlefield, the Crow warriors opened fire. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Sioux and their allies were met with a wall of bullets and arrows, and the sound of gunfire reverberated through the valley. Warriors fell to the ground, struck down before they could even reach the Crow lines. Horses screamed in fear, and the charge faltered under the sheer ferocity of the Crow defense. But the Sioux and their allies were not so easily deterred. They regrouped quickly, their own warriors closing ranks and pressing forward once more. The Crow, however, stood their ground, firing relentlessly into the enemy ranks. The repeated charges began to take their toll on the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces. The casualties were mounting, and the energy of the attackers began to wane. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of bloodshed and chaos, the charges suddenly stopped. The Crow waited, standing firm in their defensive positions, their eyes scanning the battlefield for any sign of renewed attack. The valley fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the distant moans of the wounded and the soft rustle of the wind through the grasses. It was a tense moment, one that could either signal the end of the battle or the calm before an even greater storm. Sensing an opportunity, a Crow warrior stepped forward, a glint of cunning in his eye. He had no reinforcements to call upon, no hidden army waiting in the wings to come to their aid, but he had an idea, a bluff that just might buy the Crow more time. Mounting his horse, he rode toward the enemy lines, his hands moving fluidly in sign language. His message was clear: 2 more bands of Crow warriors were on their way, soon to join the fight. His deception was simple yet effective, for the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had no way of knowing the truth. The Crow warrior turned his horse and began to ride back toward his ranks, satisfied that his bluff might have sown some seeds of doubt among the enemy. But then, something strange happened, something that none of the Crow had anticipated. Sioux scouts, positioned on the hills overlooking the battlefield, suddenly began to shout and point toward the north. Their gestures were frantic, and their cries of alarm quickly spread through the Sioux ranks. To the astonishment of everyone on the battlefield, a large war party was indeed approaching from the north, moving up the creek toward the conflict. The Sioux warriors below turned their heads to see the approaching force, and confusion rippled through their lines. Was the Crow bluff true? Were reinforcements really on their way? The Crow warriors stood frozen, staring in disbelief at the sight. Had their bluff somehow become a reality? The tension in the valley thickened as the Sioux war chiefs ordered their men to hold their ground, waiting to see what this new development would bring. As the war party drew nearer, it became clear that they were indeed Crow warriors, other bands who had heard of the approaching conflict and had come to join their brothers in arms. The sight of them sent a wave of relief through the Crow ranks. The warriors cheered, their spirits lifted by the arrival of their unexpected allies. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, however, found themselves facing a new dilemma. They had come expecting to crush the Crow with sheer numbers, but now the situation had changed. The Crow were no longer outnumbered by the overwhelming odds they had anticipated. The arrival of the reinforcements from the north breathed new life into the battle. With renewed confidence, the Crow prepared themselves for the next phase of the fight. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, though still superior in numbers, now faced a more formidable enemy than they had expected. The valley that had once seemed to promise an easy victory was now filled with uncertainty. The battle was far from over. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the plains as both sides braced themselves for the next move. War cries rang out once again, echoing across the valley as the warriors prepared to meet in battle once more. The Crow, bolstered by the arrival of their kin, stood strong, ready to defend their land and their people. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, though shaken, were not ready to back down. They had come for total victory, and they would not leave until the Crow had been defeated or they themselves lay in the dust. As the tension reached its peak, the valley once again erupted into chaos. The Battle of Pryor Creek was far from over, and the outcome remained uncertain. But one thing was clear: the Crow, against all odds, had proven themselves to be a force to be reckoned with. The plains, once thought to be a stage for the Crow's demise, had now become a theater of survival, courage, and fierce resistance. The unexpected turn of events on the battlefield began with a peculiar sight, an enormous cloud of dust rising in the distance. The Sioux scouts, who had been vigilantly monitoring the horizon, suddenly became alarmed. At first, they believed that yet another war party was speeding toward them from the west, poised to reinforce the Crow. The war chiefs squinted into the distance, their hearts pounding with the fear of a fresh enemy charge. The warriors below could now see it too, a vast dust cloud moving rapidly toward the valley, growing larger and more menacing with each passing moment. But this was no army of men. What the Sioux scouts had mistaken for a war party was actually a herd of elk, their sharp hooves pounding the earth in a frenzied stampede, spurred into a panicked run by the sounds of the battle raging around them. Their movement stirred up a thick cloud of dust that drifted toward the battlefield, momentarily throwing the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces into confusion. The battle-worn warriors had little time to process what was happening before another commotion erupted. This time, the thunderous sound of stampeding buffalo echoed across the plains. Frightened by the noise and chaos of the battle, a massive herd of buffalo had been stirred into a wild run, their powerful bodies tearing across the land and adding to the already chaotic scene. As the dust cloud thickened and the rumbling of the buffalo intensified, the Sioux war chiefs realized that they could not afford to wait any longer. They believed that they were running out of time. If they didn't break the Crow defenses soon, they feared they would be overwhelmed by the reinforcements they assumed were coming. With a sense of urgency, the Sioux war chiefs ordered a full-scale charge, hoping to smash through the Crow lines before the reinforcements could arrive. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors surged forward, their battle cries filling the air once again. But the Crow, bolstered by their strong defensive position, held their ground with a tenacity that surprised even their enemies. Arrows flew, bullets whizzed through the air, and warriors clashed in a frenzy of violence. The Crow lines held firm, and the Sioux, despite their overwhelming numbers, began to falter as they suffered heavy casualties. Just as it seemed the battle had reached a standstill, another strange sight caught the attention of the Sioux scouts. A lone warrior was seen riding hard from the hills, making his way toward the Crow defenders. This warrior was different. He wielded a two-pronged spear made from elk antler, a weapon both symbolic and deadly. Without hesitation, the lone warrior charged directly into the Sioux ranks, his spear flashing in the sunlight as he cut down warrior after warrior with astonishing precision. The Sioux opened fire on him with their rifles, but their bullets seemed to have no effect. The lone warrior weaved through their lines with a speed and agility that left them stunned. He would circle back and charge again, each time taking down more of the Sioux warriors. His fearlessness was infectious, and the sight of this one-man assault seemed to ignite something deep within the Crow defenders. Suddenly, the Crow defensive lines broke into a full charge of their own, their warriors rushing forward with a renewed ferocity. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, already disoriented by the earlier confusion, were caught off guard. Panic began to spread through their ranks, and within moments, the mighty army that had come to crush the Crow was in full retreat. It was every man for himself now, as warriors scrambled to escape the onslaught of the charging Crow. The lone Crow warrior was right behind them, his spear flashing as he pursued his fleeing enemies. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho retreated all the way back to their camp, their morale shattered. They waited there for 2 days, hoping that the warriors who had fled would return. But as the hours passed and no more men came back from the battlefield, it became clear that the battle was lost. The various bands, demoralized and weary, began to disperse. One by one, they broke camp and departed, heading back to their respective lands with the bitter knowledge that the Crow had survived yet again. The Battle of Pryor Creek was over. The plains, once filled with the sounds of war, fell silent once more. The Crow had managed to hold their ground against overwhelming odds, proving their strength, their resilience, and their cunning. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had come seeking total victory, but instead, they left with nothing but the sting of defeat. And so the legacy of Pryor Creek was sealed, a tale of bravery, of impossible odds, and of a lone warrior who turned the tide of battle. As the dust settled and the survivors began to recount the events of that fateful day, the name of the Crow would live on, etched into the history of the plains as a tribe that would not bow to defeat. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, consider supporting the channel by becoming a member. Membership comes with many perks, including early access to new content, behind-the-scenes insights, and a closer connection to our growing community of history enthusiasts.